a very good evening to you all this evening. Welcome to tonight's show. This is Damien Diamond, and you're listening to the Deep Cover Show. Tonight, the history of male circumcision. When we think about male circumcision in Ireland, or across Europe largely, we probably think of it as something performed for religious reasons. So why is the practice so popular in the United States? Harry Gourmand from Bloodstained Men and Friends joins me on this rather choppy and very unwelcome subject. Now, I caught up there during the week with Harry Gourmand from Bloodstained Men and Friends, who joins us now regarding the history of male circumcision. Now, fewer than 1/5 of European men are circumcised. In the States, however, the figure rises to almost 50% of the male population. So why is this figure so much higher than their European neighbours? Harry Gourmand from Bloodstained Men and Friends joins me now on the history of male circumcision. Good evening to you, Harry, and welcome to the show.
Good evening. Good evening. It's nice to be here with you.
Indeed. First of all, can I begin by asking you, are you, Harry, yourself circumcised?
Yes, I was subject to genital mutilation, forced amputation, when I was too young to defend myself.
Oh dear. So I take it then you feel violated by what happened. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would never choose that for myself.
Right. And can you sort of, I suppose, tell us a little about the impact that has had on you throughout your life?
Part of it, the sense of that my bodily integrity was not respected. And when I realized at about age 16 that I'd been cut, and
you were cut when you were a baby, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And when I'd previously read about circumcision, and I thought, well, thank God they never did that to me, because all I could imagine was that they would cut off the head of the penis. And I thought, well, that's barbaric. And finally I realized that, yes, they did. I am missing. There's a scar, and they did cut something off my penis. And
sure. Yeah.
that was just a devastating realization, because everything I had been trained about ethics and doing, what the difference between right and wrong is that you wouldn't do such a thing
do
to
something
someone.
like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Just,
was it something parental that you had no control over, as it were, or how did that manifest itself back at that stage?
So I was born in 1954, and at that time in the States, they sometimes weren't even asking the parents. They would just cut the boys.
Ah, okay.
So
Really?
I don't know really whether they agreed to it or whether it was just done.
Or they
without
mightn't
their-
even have known, possibly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Dear God. So, why does circumcision then happen at all? Because it strikes me as a kind of a compulsion that has to be performed by those that are in league with that.
You got that exactly right. It's an irrational compulsion, and it can only survive if you don't examine it. Because as soon as you examine it, you realize it makes no sense whatsoever to be mutilating a child's genitalia. It's just a bizarre thing to do. And,
Okay. So what is behind it then? I mean, in terms of, obviously from the US, and I made a comparison there in my opening statement, whereby it doesn't really happen in Europe anywhere near it happens in the US. So why did it become so rooted in the United States that it goes on, and it goes on even to this day, and it's been going on for hundreds of years?
Right. So it began in the 19th century when there was a masturbation hysteria. They thought at that time that masturbation caused disease. And John Harvey Kellogg of Cornflakes fame recommended causing as much pain as possible to the boy by circumcising him in order to punish him for masturbating. And so it was done to cause pain and to cause harm, so that a boy could not masturbate anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So just on that, you've lost me there, and I'll tell you why. What has John Harvey Kellogg, who's a cereal maker, got to do with circumcision throughout the United States back in the day?
Right. So this was a Seventh Day Adventist health guru. Part of their plan for reducing sexuality was to eat bland foods, and so they came up with these cereals for breakfast instead of ham or bacon or other foods that they
Yeah.
deemed to be exciting. They wanted people to eat bland foods, and cornflakes was the bland food that they recommended.
Yeah.
All of this is sort of neutralized sexuality, and circumcision was also part of the
Part of
plan
that
to,
maneuver. So,
yeah,
so are you telling me what's ultimately at the root of all this is profit?
absolutely. Today, it's $1 billion industry. The medical profession in America is making money
Yeah.
performing circumcisions, revising circumcisions, and selling the foreskins, which are very valuable. They're used in biomedical research. They're used in cosmetics. It's it's a
So there's a whole I don't know conveyor belt of profiteria there for different industries and stuff with foreskin. And it
right.
began with Mr. Kellogg himself, who wanted people eating his bland cornflakes cereal, depending on your taste. And this is how he became. Well, I presume he was a powerful person, but he recommended that circumcision was the way to enable that. One of the
Yes,
reasons. One of the reasons.
amazingly, people bought it. I just can't imagine how people could fall for it, but they did. And then after the germ theory of disease came along, and people didn't believe that masturbation caused disease anymore, they kept coming up with new excuses to keep the circumcision industry going. So it was they said it prevented STDs, which it didn't.
Okay.
That
I can't see how
headaches.
it would, to be honest with you. I really can't
Yeah,
understand that at all.
anything that people were concerned about, they would say circumcision prevents it. So cancer. So the latest one was HIV. They claim that it prevents HIV,
Yeah.
which the data doesn't show it because in America, where most of the young men were cut during the worst of the HIV epidemic,
Sure. Yeah.
we lost many, many, many young men to HIV, many more than in Europe where they were intact. So not having a foreskin, circumcision didn't help
No,
prevent
of course not.
HIV.
It's pretty obvious because when it comes to HIV, as you mentioned, I mean, having a foreskin is more of a protective than not having it. I mean, women
Right,
don't have that kind of protection in their own, anatomy. It makes no sense.
right. And but it's promoted that they're
It's
still selling
promoted
it,
that
and
way. And is it still as bad as that, Harry? Are they still going along with that spiel, that line of nonsense, if you will, trying to keep circumcision as prevalent as it is among the male populace?
sadly it is. The CDC, who have should know better, have endorsed circumcision as a HIV preventative,
Yeah, yeah.
which
But
is
they haven't proven it. They haven't backed it up with any medical evidence,
it,
obviously. Yeah.
yeah. And this mania to circumcise has led HIV, the UN AIDS, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief in Africa, and the CDC and UN and USAID,
Mm.
all these organizations to promote circumcision in sub-Saharan Africa on the guise that it prevents HIV. And they've mutilated 25 million African men and boys already, and they're just at it full tilt.
My God,
This is
it's really hard to comprehend. I'm having difficulty there myself. Now, circumcision,
right.
it was also in the Bible as well, wasn't it? There was a reference to it. I think was it
Right.
Genesis
Genesis 17. Yes.
17? Right. Okay. Yeah. And they didn't like boys pleasuring themselves. I'm guessing is what happened, or what was behind that ultimately. Would that be reasonable?
Well, it's sort of interesting that Genesis 15, there's two versions of Genesis. Genesis
Okay.
15, there is a covenant between the Jews and their God, and the covenant is kept by an animal sacrifice. And then about 1,000 years later, a new version comes out, Genesis
Okay.
17, and they changed it from an animal sacrifice to a human sacrifice because if you sacrifice any part of a human, that's a human sacrifice. Circumcision is a human sacrifice.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah.
So somehow, which whoever decided to make this change did the most sadistic act in history, because the result was that millions and millions of boys were mutilated because
And
of this
yeah,
text.
and as I mentioned earlier too, it's still going on to this day from hundreds of years ago, even further back. I mean, okay, we'll say in the 19th century, as I understand it, it was seen as good hygiene, a habit of the upper classes, including the royal family, I believe. Um, what does that
And
say
they
about
should
them?
know better.
you know,
Right.
but
I mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
they have access to the best information. How they got suckered into that is
yeah,
beyond my understanding.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It boggles the mind that it's still going on here in 2024, and to the almighty huge scale that 50% of American men are circumcised, give or take a fraction or so.
Right.
Yeah,
That's we hear different numbers. Sometimes we hear 70%, sometimes we hear 50%, but it's a lot. It's and the thing is, it's a self-perpetuating thing, because if a man hasn't really come to grips with the fact that he was harmed for no good reason,
yeah.
and that he's lost something, and that he has a reduced sexuality, which he's never experienced sex as it was supposed to be
Well, that's
because
very
he's
true
been
because it's the foreskin
blinded.
it's got the most sensitive sexual. I don't know the exact word.
The most sensitivity, the most
Most
erogenous.
sensitivity when you're having sex. So, like, if they didn't experience that because they never had it, how would they know how great sex can actually and wonderful it can be?
Well, one way I explain it to cut men is that often the most sensitive part of the penis for a cut man is the foreskin or the circumcision scar.
Okay, right.
And if you explain that, well, as an adult, you would have had 15 square inches more skin there if you hadn't
Yeah.
been cut, which would have been at least as sensitive as that and more. And you're just missing out.
So
You're
what you're
just
saying, to put it in a nutshell, is 15 times more the pleasure. Is that reasonable?
I think that's a
Yeah,
good,
yeah.
yeah.
And depending on the woman you're with or whatever your partner is, it could be even more. But let's clarify: there is no upside, excuse the pun, or benefit really medically of any kind in this happening to a male, is there?
As there are rare cases where there is a circumcision is needed, but it's really, really rare. So
Right.
in Finland,
Yeah.
where they don't like to cut off foreskins,
Hmm.
they do autopsies at the end of life, and the autopsies show about 2% of Finnish men end their life without their foreskin. So somewhere along the course of their life, something happened where they had a circumcision.
Yeah.
But that is, compare that to America, where they begin their life with an unnecessary
Procedure of circumcision.
procedure.
Yeah.
And and so with no, they're perfectly healthy. They don't have any diagnosis. There's nothing wrong. They're just fine, and yet they do this terrible amputation. Anyway, it's hard for men to come to for cut men to face this, and
Mm.
so if you give them a reason, that if you tell them something, oh, it was good for you, it prevents disease, they'll cling to that immediately, because it's easier to believe that it was done for a good reason than to believe it was just sheer brutality and ignorance, and they're just a victim, and they just, it's hard for men to feel violated like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the problem in terms of how it continues is that those guys, if they haven't really faced what happened to them,
Hmm.
when they have a son, they'll say, I want my boy to look like me because I'm fine just the way I am.
Oh. Yeah.
And then the wife may know that it's wrong, but can't resist, or can't, it doesn't have the
And that is
strength.
perpetual, Harry, isn't it? That kind of what you've just said. It's perpetual among American families in particular.
It right. The best way to stop it is to stop the funding. That whenever the funding stops, then the rate goes down.
Yeah.
So that is the most effective way of putting an end to it.
I understand that. And is there any reality of that being close at any time soon?
The funding is actually illegal in most cases in the United States because it is not medically indicated, and you can't use public money, which is about a third of circumcisions are paid for with public money.
A third,
Can't
as
use
much as
public
that. Yeah.
money for non-therapeutic, unnecessary procedures.
Yeah.
So it's illegal, but it's still being done in most states.
Yeah. And yet it goes on, as you say. But look, it's good to sit and chat with you here this evening, and hopefully we'll get to a wider range of ears and better understanding as to what it is.
Yes.
It's the reason we're here, you know?
We're working on it.
Indeed. Harry Gourmand, do not give up the good fight. Yourself, of course, the spokesperson from Bloodstained Men and Friends regarding the history of male circumcision, which is why you're on here this evening with me. Thank you very much, Harry, for joining me.
Thank you so much, Damien. It was great to be here with you.
You're listening to Deep Cover with Damien Diamond.